Captain Harold Mitchell was hunting for something falling out of the sky, and nobody had told him what it was. His aircraft was called Pelican 9. It was a C-119J, a flying boxcar, a fat twin boom cargo hauler with a reputation for being underpowered and unglamorous, and it had never been designed to catch anything at all. The Air Force had bolted a trailing rig of hooks and cable to the back of it and given it to a squadron whose existence was classified. His orders came down to a single line: find the parachute, catch it before it touches the water. Whatever hung beneath that parachute, he was not cleared to know. He never asked. In that squadron, you learned quickly not to. It was August 19, 1960. The crew had briefed at 7 in the morning at Hickam Air Force Base on Oahu, and they had lifted off 2 hours later into a clear Pacific sky. The search box was roughly 360 miles southwest of Honolulu, out over open ocean where the water runs thousands of meters deep and keeps whatever it takes. And if Mitchell missed the thing, under that parachute would hit the sea. Bob for a while, and then a plug of compressed salt built into its base would quietly dissolve, and it would flood, and it would sink. Deliberately. That was not a design flaw. That was a design feature. Somebody, somewhere in Washington, had decided that losing this object forever at the bottom of the Pacific was far better than the alternative, which somebody else was finding it first. The United States of America had been trying to do this for 19 straight months. It had failed every single time. Before we go any further, I want to ask you for one small thing. This is a small Cold War history channel, and the reach has been sliding lately. If this is the kind of research you want to see more of, then subscribe, drop a comment, and share the video with someone who would appreciate it. Those 3 things are what keep these deep dives possible. Now back to the Pacific. For most of a decade, the most powerful nation on Earth had been guessing. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a literal description of the American strategic position in the late 1950s. The United States did not know how many intercontinental ballistic missiles the Soviet Union possessed. It did not know where they were kept. It did not know whether they worked, how long they took to launch, or whether they could reach American cities at all. The Soviet Union covered roughly 1/6 of the land surface of the planet. It was closed. It had no free press, no accessible archives, no tourist access to militarily sensitive regions, and a counterintelligence apparatus that was, whatever else you want to say about it, extremely good at its job. There was exactly one reliable way to find out what was inside it, and that was to physically place a camera above it and take a photograph. America had built a way to do that. It was one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever designed. And on the 1st of May, 1960, that aircraft had been blown out of the stratosphere over the Ural Mountains, and its pilot had been captured alive and paraded on Soviet television, and the entire program had been shut down by order of the President of the United States. So on the morning Harold Mitchell went looking for a parachute over the Pacific, the United States had been completely blind over the Soviet Union for 110 days. Not degraded, not partially covered. And in that darkness, a number had taken root. It grew in the newspapers, in the Senate, in the Pentagon, and in a presidential campaign then underway. The Soviets had hundreds of intercontinental missiles, perhaps 500, perhaps 1,000, perhaps 1,500 by 1963, against barely 100 American ones. They called it the Missile Gap. It was about to help decide an American election, and it would justify billions of dollars of spending, and it was one of the largest intelligence failures of the 20th century. The thing that finally destroyed it was not a defector. It was not a codebreaker, or a mole, or a stolen document. It was a bucket of film. 20 pounds of exposed photographic negative, sealed inside a metal capsule roughly the size of a household water heater, falling out of orbit toward the ocean with a plug of salt in its belly, quietly counting down the seconds to self-destruction. And to understand how a falling bucket of film took apart the defining fear of the early Cold War, we need to go back several years to the moment the United States built itself an eye, and then watch that eye get shot out of the sky. Start with the fear, because the fear came first, and it was manufactured out of genuine ignorance rather than malice. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The satellite itself was almost trivial. It was a polished aluminum sphere with 4 whip antennas, and it did essentially nothing except transmit a repeating radio pulse that amateur operators all over the world could pick up. But the satellite was not the point. The rocket underneath it was the point. That rocket was an R-7, and it was an intercontinental ballistic missile. The physics is not subtle. If you can put a metal sphere into orbit, you can put a thermonuclear warhead onto a city. Sputnik was not a science project. It was a public demonstration of throw weight, and every general and every senator in Washington understood exactly what it meant within about an hour of the announcement. 5 weeks later, a committee handed President Dwight Eisenhower a document that would poison American strategic thinking for years. It was formally titled Deterrence and Survival in the Nuclear Age. Everyone called it the Gaither Report, after its chairman, Horace Rowan Gaither Jr., a founder of the Rand Corporation and chairman of the Ford Foundation. Much of its actual drafting was done by Paul Nitze, the author of the seminal 1950 document known as NSC 68, a man who had spent his career arguing that the United States chronically underestimated the Soviet threat. The report was presented on November 7, 1957. It warned that the Soviet Union could possess a significant intercontinental ballistic missile capability by the end of 1959. It warned that this capability could catch the American bomber force on the ground in a surprise attack during a period of apparent calm. It recommended an urgent buildup of American missiles, a dispersed and alert bomber force, and an enormous national program of fallout shelters. It was classified top secret. It stayed that way for exactly 6 weeks. On December 20, 1957, a reporter named Chalmers Roberts put the substance of it on the front page of the Washington Post. His story described a nation facing what the report called the gravest danger in its history, a country sliding toward second-class power status. Now, here is what matters, and here is what the panic obscured. The Gaither Report's alarm about Soviet missiles rested substantially on estimates generated by United States Air Force intelligence, and those estimates ran into the hundreds and eventually into the neighborhood of 1,000 deployed Soviet intercontinental missiles. Those numbers were wrong, not slightly wrong. Wrong by orders of magnitude, and it is worth pausing on why the Air Force produced the highest numbers of any American service. The Central Intelligence Agency's estimates were lower. The Army's were lower still. The Navy's were the lowest of all. The service that projected the largest Soviet missile force happened to be the service that stood to receive the largest budget increase, if that force existed. Nobody has ever proven deliberate fabrication. But institutions tend to believe the things that are good for them. And this was not the last time in American history that would happen. Eisenhower read the Gaither Report carefully, and then he mostly declined to act on it. He would not authorize the shelter program. He would not authorize the crash missile buildup. He told his own advisors bluntly that the country had to cut the cost of its missile programs or go broke. Why was he so unmoved when nearly everyone around him was terrified? Because Eisenhower had a secret. He had a source of information that nobody in the Senate had, that no columnist had, that even most of his own cabinet did not know existed. And it was flying at 70,000 feet. The U-2 should not have been possible. It was designed by Clarence Johnson, a Lockheed engineer, universally known as Kelly, working out of a walled-off division in Burbank, California, that the employees themselves nicknamed the Skunk Works. Johnson's solution to the problem of flying above Soviet air defenses was, in essence, to build a jet-powered glider. Enormous, thin, high aspect ratio wings. An airframe stripped of almost everything that made an aircraft rugged. A machine so structurally delicate that a hard maneuver could tear it apart, and so aerodynamically fragile at altitude that the gap between its stall speed and its maximum speed narrowed to a knife edge that pilots called coffin corner. But it flew above 70,000 feet. Declassified records show operational missions running higher still. And at that altitude, in 1955, nothing in the Soviet inventory could reach it. Eisenhower approved the program on November 24, 1954. It was given the code name Aquatone, and it was placed under the Central Intelligence Agency rather than the Air Force, which was a deliberate choice and an important one. The man Eisenhower put in charge of it was Richard Bissell. Bissell is one of the strangest and most consequential figures in the history of American intelligence. He was an economist by training, a Yale man, a former academic, brilliant, arrogant, ferociously effective, and completely unsentimental. He had no background in aviation whatsoever. He built the U-2 program from nothing, in near total secrecy, and Johnson delivered the first flying aircraft in roughly 8 months. Test pilot Tony LaVere got it airborne at a dry lake bed in Nevada in early August 1955, more or less by accident, during what was supposed to be a high-speed taxi test. The glider wing simply decided to fly. Now hold 2 facts in your head at the same time, because the tension between them is the entire story. Fact 1. Eisenhower knew that flying an aircraft across the sovereign airspace of the Soviet Union in peacetime, without permission, taking photographs of its military installations, was a violation of international law. He knew that if one was ever caught, the consequences would be severe. He agonized over it. He personally approved individual missions, one at a time, weighing each one. Fact 2. He had already tried to do it legally, and Khrushchev had said no. In July 1955, at the Geneva summit, Eisenhower stood up and proposed something remarkable. It was called Open Skies. Each superpower would hand the other a complete map of its military installations and then permit the other to fly aerial reconnaissance over its territory, freely, to verify it. The idea was to abolish the terror of the unknown by abolishing the unknown. Khrushchev rejected it almost immediately and privately dismissed it as a transparent espionage scheme. He was not entirely wrong about that. But consider what his rejection actually did. Khrushchev slammed the door on mutual transparency, and, by doing so, he guaranteed that the United States would try to see anyway, by other means, illegally, and that when it finally succeeded, it would owe him nothing. The overflights began in 1956, and here is the detail that gets left out of nearly every popular account. The Soviets saw the U-2 from the very first flight. American planners had convinced themselves the aircraft would be effectively invisible to Soviet radar at extreme altitude. That assumption was wrong. Soviet radar operators tracked the U-2 over Moscow and Leningrad in July 1956 on its earliest deep missions, and Moscow lodged a diplomatic protest almost immediately. They could not always hold the track. They absolutely could not shoot it down. But they knew it was there, and they knew roughly where it went. Which meant that Soviet planners could do something very simple and very effective. They could put the things they wanted hidden where the airplane had not looked. And the airplane could not look at very much. This is the crucial limitation that the missile gap panic never grappled with. Across 4 years of operations, the U-2 flew 24 deep penetration overflights of the Soviet Union. 24. In total, the program developed more than 1,285,000 feet of film and photographed more than 1,300,000 square miles of Soviet territory. Set that against the size of the Soviet Union, and it amounts to roughly 15% of the country. 15% in 4 years in narrow ribbons along routes the enemy could observe on radar. Every U-2 mission was a single thin line drawn across an enormous blank map, and the missiles, if they existed in the numbers the Air Force claimed, could be anywhere in the other 85%. So, Eisenhower had better information than his critics, and it still was not good enough to settle the argument. He could not prove a negative. He could not stand up in front of the Senate and say, "I have looked, and the missiles are not there." First, because he had not looked at most of the country, and second, because he could not admit the program existed at all. That was the trap. And on May 1, 1960, the trap slammed shut. A U-2 flown by a Central Intelligence Agency pilot named Francis Gary Powers crossed into Soviet airspace on a mission code named Grand Slam. It was the 24th deep overflight, and it was intended to cross the entire Soviet Union from south to north. Near Sverdlovsk, deep in the Urals, a Soviet air defense unit fired a salvo of S-75 surface-to-air missiles at him. 14 missiles went up. One of them shot down a pursuing Soviet MiG-19 and killed its pilot. One of them detonated close enough to Powers. The aircraft came apart around him, He got out. He came down by parachute into a Soviet field in a flight suit without insignia, carrying a needle tipped with shellfish toxin that he did not use, and local farmers held him until the security services arrived. And then Nikita Khrushchev did something politically brilliant. He announced that the Soviet Union had shot down an American aircraft. He said nothing about the pilot. He let the United States government step forward and issue the prepared cover story, which was that a civilian weather research aircraft had suffered oxygen difficulties and drifted off course. Then he produced the pilot, alive, along with the wreckage, along with the cameras. The Eisenhower administration had been caught lying in public, and the President of the United States, who prized personal integrity above almost everything, had been the one to sign off on the lie. The Paris summit that was supposed to open 2 weeks later collapsed in acrimony. And Eisenhower made a decision he never reversed. No more manned overflights of the Soviet Union, not one. He had just blinded his own country on purpose, and he understood exactly what he had done. He also believed he had no alternative, because the alternative was a shooting war over a photograph. Now, a coincidence of the calendar so perfect that no screenwriter would risk it. Francis Gary Powers went on trial in Moscow in the Hall of Columns on August 17, 1960. The proceedings ran 3 days, and the Soviets turned it into a global spectacle, a public exhibition of the captured American eye. On the second day of that trial, at a launch complex on the California coast, a Thor Agena rocket lifted off, carrying a satellite that the Air Force called Discoverer 14. The Soviets were displaying the corpse of American reconnaissance in a Moscow courtroom, and at that precise moment, 9,000 kilometers away, the Americans were launching its replacement. Neither Khrushchev nor anyone in that courtroom had the faintest idea. Let us talk about the man on the other side, because if you make him a fool, the story collapses, and he was not a fool. Nikita Khrushchev was the son of peasants. He had survived Stalin, which by itself puts him in a very small category of human beings. He had outmaneuvered Beria and Malenkov in the succession struggle. In 1956, he had stood up at a closed session of the 20th Party Congress and denounced Stalin's crimes in a speech that fractured the communist world. He governed a country that had lost more than 20 million people in the Second World War and had rebuilt itself into a nuclear superpower inside of 15 years. He was crude, impulsive, and frequently underestimated. He was also a genuinely shrewd reader of his opponents, and he understood something about power that a great many more sophisticated men never grasp. What matters is not always what you have. Very often, what matters is what your adversary believes you have. After Sputnik, Khrushchev watched the Western reaction with something close to delight, and he realized he had been handed an asset that cost him almost nothing to exploit. So he talked. He told the world repeatedly and in public that Soviet rockets were rolling off the production lines. He put it in the language of a man who had grown up around factories and butcher shops. The Soviet Union, he liked to say, was turning out missiles like sausages. Soviet state announcements declared flatly that Soviet intercontinental missiles were in mass production. Missiles rolled through Red Square on their transporters, past reviewing stands packed with Western military attachés who counted them, photographed them with long lenses, and cabled the numbers back to their capitals. According to Vladimir Semikasny, who later chaired the KGB, at least some of what those attachés were photographing was theatre. Semikasny described a deliberate deception program in which mock-ups were paraded through the capital and then hauled to railway stations in full view of foreign observers to suggest deployments that were not happening. Historians treat his account with appropriate caution, and it would be wrong to claim that everything in those parades was fake, because Western analysts genuinely did learn real things from parade photography. But the deception was real, and it was intentional, and it was aimed directly at the men with the cameras. There was precedent. At the Soviet Air Show of 1955, a formation of heavy bombers flew past the reviewing stand, disappeared, circled out of sight, and flew past again. Western observers dutifully counted them as separate aircraft and reported that the Soviet Union possessed a strategic bomber force far larger than it actually did. That episode entered history as the Bomber Gap, and it was, in every important respect, a rehearsal for what came next. Khrushchev's own people admitted the bluff, once it was safe to do so. His aide, Oleg Troyanovsky, said years afterward that Khrushchev's public claim that the Soviet Union could strike any point on the globe with its missiles was, in Troyanovsky's own word, bluffing. Anticipatory bluffing. It was, he said, simply part of how Khrushchev operated, and his son, Sergei Khrushchev, an engineer who worked in the missile design world himself, asked his father directly why he inflated the numbers. The answer his father gave is one of the most honest things any Cold War leader ever said about deterrence. The number of missiles they actually possessed, Khrushchev told his son, was not the important thing. The important thing was that the Americans believed in Soviet power. That was the strategy. In its entirety. And it rested on one assumption, an assumption that had held for every year of Khrushchev's rule and Stalin's before him and the Tsar's before that. But the outsiders could not see in. Here is what he was hiding behind that assumption. The R-7, the rocket that launched Sputnik and terrified the West, was a magnificent piece of engineering and a genuinely dreadful weapon. Its chief designer was Sergei Korolev, and Korolev's own story tells you a great deal about the system he served. He was arrested during the Great Purge in 1938 and sent to Kolyma, the coldest and deadliest corner of the Gulag, where he mined gold, developed scurvy, lost most of his teeth, and very nearly died. He was eventually pulled out and put to work in a prison design bureau. He was later rehabilitated and made the technical master of the entire Soviet rocket effort, and his identity was so tightly classified that in public he had no name at all. He was referred to only as the chief designer. The world did not learn who he was until his obituary appeared in 1966. Korolev's ambition was space. It always had been. The military application was, for him, the price of admission. And the machine he built reflected that. The R-7 stood more than 30 meters tall. It burned kerosene and liquid oxygen. Liquid oxygen is cryogenic, which means it boils off continuously and cannot simply be left sitting in a tank. Fueling an R-7 for launch took most of a working day on the order of 20 hours, and once fueled, it could not be kept standing on alert for much more than a day before the liquid oxygen boiled away and the system had to stand down. Think about what that means in a nuclear exchange measured in minutes. It could not be concealed either. It required an enormous fixed launch complex with rail spurs, cranes, propellant plants, and a support town. It was from the air one of the most conspicuous objects a nation could build, and there were almost none of them. The Soviets originally planned something on the order of 50 operational complexes. They abandoned that plan. They were not stupid. They ran the same arithmetic anyone else could run, and the arithmetic said the R-7 was a dead end as a weapon. As early as December 1956, the leadership tasked a rival designer, Mikhail Yangel, with producing a missile that used storable propellants and could actually sit in a hole in the ground waiting for a war. In the meantime, the operational Soviet Intercontinental Force was built at a site in the pine forests of Arkhangelsk Oblast, hundreds of kilometers north of Moscow, at a place with the secret designation Angara. The world would come to know it as Plesk. It was chosen because it sat far enough north that a missile fired from it over the pole had the range to reach the United States. At its peak, the entire deployed Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile force consisted of roughly 4 launch pads at Plesetsk, plus 1 at the Baikonur test range. 4 pads. According to the specialist literature on the Soviet rocket program, their missiles were assigned to New York, Washington, Los Angeles, and Chicago. Not 400, not 1,000. 4 launch complexes, each holding a rocket that took the better part of a day to fuel at fixed locations that a single warhead could erase. That was the arsenal. That was the entire thing. And it was working perfectly because nobody could see it. The men who eventually broke the bluff had been arguing for their idea since before anyone on Earth had put anything into orbit. In 1954, at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, 2 analysts named Merton Davies and Amram Katz wrote down a proposal that read, at the time, like Pulp Fiction. Put a camera into orbit, Let the Earth rotate underneath it so that the camera sweeps the whole surface, expose film, then eject the film in a capsule, drop it back through the atmosphere, and catch it before it hits the ground. Every single element of that sentence was, in 1954, impossible. Nobody had orbited anything. Nobody had recovered anything from orbit. No camera existed that could survive a launch, operate in hard vacuum, hold focus across enormous temperature swings, and resolve useful detail from more than 100 miles up. No film existed that would survive out there. No heat shield existed for an object that small. And nobody in the history of aviation had ever plucked a falling object out of the sky with an airplane. The proposal sat on a shelf. Then Sputnik went up and the U-2 started to look like a diplomatic time bomb, and suddenly the impossible idea on the shelf was the only idea anyone had. The program was authorized in February 1958. Eisenhower put it once again under Richard Bissell at the Central Intelligence Agency, with Air Force support directed by Brigadier General Osmond Ritland, and he buried it under the deepest secrecy the American government could generate. The satellite program was called Corona. The camera system was called Keyhole. Those two words would not be spoken in public for 35 years. What the public got instead was an entirely fictional program called Discoverer, announced as a scientific and engineering research effort. Space environment studies, re-entry vehicle development, biomedical research. There were press releases and photographs of mice being loaded into capsules and earnest official talk of eventually sending up a primate. Underneath the cover story, an industrial coalition went to work. Douglas built the Thor booster. Lockheed built the Agena upper stage and integrated the vehicle. General Electric built the re-entry capsule, iTech designed the camera, and Fairchild manufactured the first one. And in Rochester, New York, Eastman Kodak took on a problem that nobody had ever faced. Photographic film at that time was coated onto a base of cellulose acetate. Nobody had ever asked what acetate does in the vacuum of space. What it does is become brittle. Not slightly, it embrittles to the point where the film physically shatters and snaps as it is pulled through the camera transport. And the failure did not reliably show up in low-pressure ground testing, which meant that early missions were flying cameras that were, in effect, feeding themselves broken glass. Kodak's answer was to abandon acetate entirely and coat the emulsion onto a polyester base, a material supplied by DuPont and marketed under the name Estar. It survived vacuum, it resisted tearing, and as a bonus, it weighed roughly half as much, which on a rocket is not a bonus at all. It is everything. Kodak did this work at a facility on the Genesee River in Rochester called Hawkeye, inside a compartmented operation known as Bridgehead. The people who worked there processed the film that came back from these missions for decades and could not tell their families what they did for a living. And then, having assembled all of that, the program proceeded to fail 13 consecutive times. It is difficult to convey the scale of the failure without it starting to sound like farce. Discoverer 1 went up from Vandenberg in February 1959 and became the first object ever placed into polar orbit, which was a genuine milestone, except that its telemetry was so intermittent that the program could never conclusively confirm what it had done. Discoverer 2, in April 1959, carried a recovery capsule but no camera. A timer malfunctioned. The capsule separated a full orbit early, re-entered over the Arctic, and came down somewhere near Spitsbergen in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard. Search parties went out across the ice and found nothing. The most probable explanation is that it went into the sea and sank. There has always been a persistent story that Soviet agents recovered it first, and that story has never been proven, and honest history has to say so plainly. What the incident did do was inspire a best-selling novel and later a film about a race to a downed capsule in the Arctic. Discoverer 3 carried 4 black mice as part of the cover story. The Agena stage fired in the wrong attitude and drove the entire vehicle into the Pacific. Discoverer 4 failed to achieve orbit at all, and so it went, month after month, launch after launch. Retrorockets that fired backwards and pushed capsules into higher orbits instead of bringing them home. Capsules that re-entered and were never located. Attitude control failures. Capsules that splashed down hundreds of miles from the recovery fleet. Cameras that fogged. Film that broke. One program manager, in an account declassified long afterward, ran through the catalogue in a tone of pure exhaustion. A launch aborted on the pad. A capsule driven into the ground in the wrong place. A launch that simply did not work. Power failures, thermal problems, procedural problems. Someone inside the program summarized 19 months of it in 5 words. It was a most heartbreaking business. Now, think about Richard Bissell's position, because it is genuinely extraordinary. He was spending enormous sums of taxpayer money on a program the public believed was about mice. Every failure was a public embarrassment, covered in the newspapers as another American space flop. He could not explain what the program was actually for. He could not defend it. He could not point to progress, because the progress was classified. He could not even tell most of his own government why any of it mattered. He absorbed all of it, and he kept launching. Then in April 1960, Discoverer 11 went up, and something worked. The camera ran. The new polyester film held together in vacuum. For the first time in history, a machine in orbit took photographs of the Earth below with the intent of bringing them home. And on the way down, the spin stabilization motors on the re-entry capsule exploded, and the capsule was destroyed, and every frame of the first photographs ever taken from orbit went into the Pacific Ocean. 2 weeks after that, Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Sverdlovsk. Hold that moment. May of 1960. The U-2 is grounded forever. The satellite program has failed roughly a dozen consecutive times, and the one time the camera worked, the film was lost. American estimates of Soviet missile strength range from a handful to well over 1,000, depending entirely on which service you ask. There is a presidential election in November in which one candidate is campaigning hard on a missile gap that nobody on Earth can actually measure. The United States has no eyes, no consensus, and no way to settle the argument. The word gap entered the American political vocabulary through a young senator from Massachusetts. In August 1958, John Kennedy told the Senate that the nation could have afforded, and could still afford, the steps necessary to close the missile gap. He returned to the theme relentlessly through 1960, warning that the Soviets had made the great breakthrough in missiles and would therefore be ahead in the decisive weapons of war in the early 1960s. Senator Stuart Symington, a former Secretary of the Air Force, pushed the highest figures he could obtain into the public debate. The columnist Joseph Alsop published claims that classified estimates put the Soviet force as high as 1,500 missiles by 1963 against 130 American ones. Whether Kennedy privately knew the gap was fiction is a question historians still argue about, and the honest answer is that nobody can prove it. He was briefed by the Director of Central Intelligence, Allen Dulles, in July 1960. What Dulles actually told him in that room was never documented, and the surviving accounts are second-hand. Some scholars argue Kennedy knowingly exploited a claim he had reason to doubt. Others argue he was relying, like everyone else, on inflated Air Force numbers being fed to him by Symington and on speculation in the press. What is not in dispute is that he kept using it right up to Election Day, and that it worked. Eisenhower, watching this, was privately furious. He believed the estimates were inflated. He believed the panic was being driven by institutional appetite rather than evidence, and he could not say so because saying so would require revealing how he knew. On January 17, 1961, 3 days before he handed the presidency to Kennedy, Eisenhower delivered his farewell address and warned the American people about the acquisition of unwarranted influence by what he called the military-industrial complex. Historians have argued ever since about exactly what was in his mind when he wrote those words. He never publicly connected the speech to the missile gap. But he had spent 4 years watching a threat get inflated by the institutions that would profit from it while he sat on evidence he could not show anyone. Draw your own conclusions. On August 10, 1960, Discoverer 13 lifted off from Vandenberg. It carried no camera and no film. It was a pure diagnostic flight, an end-to-end test of the machinery of recovery. The only thing of interest aboard was an American flag. The capsule came down in the Pacific, the recovery aircraft could not reach it in time, and it hit the water. But the salt plug had not yet done its work, and the Navy was standing by. A helicopter launched from a ship, divers went into the ocean, they got a flotation collar around the capsule, and they hauled it up. It was the first man-made object ever recovered from orbit by any nation in the history of the world. 5 days later, at the White House, the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Thomas White, presented the flag from inside that capsule to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower held it and remarked that the flag had certainly now acquired a unique history for itself, and he promised to put it somewhere all Americans could see it. It was a lovely moment, and it was almost entirely a performance. The flag was the cover story made physical. It was a photo opportunity staged for a program whose real purpose could not be spoken aloud in that room, in front of those cameras, by any of the men standing there. The mission that actually mattered launched 8 days later. Discoverer 14 lifted off from Vandenberg Air Force Base on August 18, 1960 at 55 minutes past 7 in the evening, Greenwich Mean Time. The Thor burned out and fell away. The Agena took over and pushed the vehicle into a near-polar orbit, roughly 116 miles above the Earth at its lowest point and about 500 miles at its highest, circling the planet once every 94.5 minutes. It very nearly failed. Immediately, the satellite came out of injection, mispositioned, and started to tumble. And for the first orbits, the ground controllers did not know whether they had another dead machine on their hands. It stabilized. And then the camera started to run. The camera was a single panoramic unit with a 24-inch focal length, looking straight down, sweeping back and forth across the line of flight. And because the satellite was in a polar orbit while the Earth rotated beneath it, every pass laid down a completely fresh strip of territory. The strips marched westward across the Soviet Union, one after another, hour after hour. This was not a ribbon drawn across a map. This was a comb going through it. For 17 orbits, the camera ran, exposing roughly 20 pounds of Esterbase film, something in the region of 3,000 feet of it. And then, on the 17th pass, over Alaska, the capsule separated from the satellite. The retrockets fired correctly, the heat shield held, and a container of exposed photographic film began falling out of orbit toward the Pacific Ocean. Which brings us back to Harold Mitchell at 8,000 feet in a flying boxcar. By Mitchell's own later account, his maintenance chief, a technical sergeant named Louis Bannock, had found an intake leak in a cylinder of one of the aircraft's engines, and the ground crew had worked through the night to change it out so the aircraft could fly at all. That detail routinely gets cut from the story, and it should not be. If Bannock had missed that leak, Pelican 9 turns back over open water on one engine, and the capsule hits the sea, and the salt plug does exactly what it was engineered to do. And the first photographs ever returned from space sink 4,000 meters into the Pacific. The parachute was sighted. Mitchell brought the aircraft around and lined up. The first pass was for position. He came around and lined the aircraft up, judging the drift, working the boxcar onto a target that was sinking through the air the whole time he was looking at it. The second pass refined it. Understand that there is no version of this where he gets unlimited attempts. The capsule is falling continuously. Below it is open ocean and a dissolving plug of salt. On the third pass, the trailing gear caught the canopy. The line snapped taut. The winch took the strain, and the crew hauled the capsule in through the open rear of the aircraft, and the first photographic film ever returned from orbit came aboard a United States Air Force cargo plane, roughly 360 miles from Honolulu. It was the first mid-air recovery of an object returning from space in human history. Bannock, the man who had saved the engine, reached into the front of his flight suit and pulled out a torn piece of orange nylon he had cut from the recovered parachute and handed it to his pilot. "For you, Captain," he said. "They will never miss it." Then they flew home, and most of the men on that aircraft were never told what they had caught. The film went to Kodak in Rochester for processing, and from there to a building at 5th and K Streets in Northwest Washington that housed one of the most important organizations of the Cold War and one of the least known. In 1960, it was called the Photographic Intelligence Center, and it would not be renamed the National Photographic Interpretation Center until the following January. It occupied the upper floors of a working automobile dealership. That is not a joke. The most sensitive imagery in the possession of the United States government was analyzed above a car showroom in a building shared with salesmen, because that was the cover and because the budget was what it was. The man who ran it was Arthur Lundell. Lundell was a geologist from Chicago who had served as a Navy photo interpreter in the Aleutians during the Second World War, and he essentially invented the modern discipline of imagery intelligence. He built a team of analysts who could look at a grey smear on a photographic negative and tell you what it was, how tall it was, what it was for, and what would be there next month. He was a superb bureaucratic operator and a genuinely beloved boss, and outside a small professional world, almost nobody has heard of him. On August 19, 1960, Lundell gathered his staff and told them he had something new and something great to show them. He put up a map of the Soviet Union with the coverage from a single satellite mission drawn onto it. 8 broad swaths running north to south, marching across the country. For 4 years, the U-2 had drawn 24 thin lines. This was one flight, in one day covering more than 1/5 of the entire Soviet Union. The room broke into cheering. Then the analysts went to work and the technical verdict came back. Some frames had been fogged by electrostatic discharge inside the camera, an artifact of the new film. The ground resolution was in the range of 20 to 30 feet, which is coarse by later standards, and was more than enough to identify an airfield, a rail spur, a launch complex, or a bomber sitting on a hardstand. The assessment of the imagery quality was good to very good. The official accounting is stark. That single mission covered more than 1,650,000 square miles of Soviet territory. It produced more imagery of the Soviet Union than every U-2 flight ever flown, combined. From that single load of film, analysts identified 64 Soviet airfields and 26 surface-to-air missile sites, meaning air defense installations, that American intelligence had not previously located. For the men running American intelligence, the transformation in the months that followed was total. They had spent years starving for information about the Soviet interior. Now they were drowning in it. Now, the part where popular accounts overreach and where this one is going to slow down and be careful. Discoverer 14 did not, on its own, count the Soviet missile force and end the missile gap in a single afternoon. That version is clean and satisfying, and it is not true. And telling it would insult what actually happened, which is stranger and in some ways more impressive. What Discoverer 14 proved was that the machine worked, the rocket worked. The camera worked, the film held, the capsule came home. The airplane caught it. Every impossible item on that 1954 RAN memo had been done in sequence on the same day. And the exposed negative was on a light table in Washington. And once a thing like that works, once, it can be repeated. It was repeated for the next 12 years. What followed was not a revelation. It was an accumulation. Mission after mission, swath after swath, the analysts above the car dealership filled in the map of the Soviet Union, and what the filling in revealed was emptiness. They looked where the Air Force estimates required missiles to be. The missiles were not there. They looked for the enormous unmissable launch complexes that an R-7 requires, and they found a handful. Plesetsk was identified. The first Soviet operational intercontinental ballistic missile complex confirmed by satellite photo interpretation was reported in July 1961 at a site called Uria, nearly a year after Discoverer 14 flew. By October 1961, the total number of operational Soviet intercontinental missile complexes that Corona had found stood at 4. The reckoning arrived in a document. On September 21, 1961, the American intelligence community issued a national intelligence estimate. Its prose was flat and bureaucratic, and its content was a demolition. It stated that present Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile strength was in the range of 10 to 25 launchers capable of firing at the United States, and that this force level would not increase markedly in the immediate months ahead. 10 to 25. Prior estimates had run to 140 to 200 and higher. Air Force intelligence had argued for far more. The newspapers had printed 1,000 and 1,500. A presidential campaign had been fought partly on the proposition that the United States was falling behind. At that moment, the United States possessed roughly 60 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles of its own, plus a strategic bomber force the Soviets could not remotely match, plus a growing fleet of missile submarines. There was a missile gap It ran in America's favor, and it always had. There is one more number, and it deserves to be said slowly, because it is the most remarkable figure in this entire story. Historians working from the declassified record have concluded that the true number of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles actually capable of striking the United States in that period, including interim prototypes pressed into service, was 4. 4 missiles, on 4 pads, at one complex in a northern forest, requiring most of a day to fuel, and unable to sit ready for more than a few hours once fueled. That was the arsenal behind the sausage speech. That was the force behind the Red Square parades, behind the Gaither Report, behind the campaign rhetoric, behind billions of dollars of accelerated American procurement, behind the fallout shelters that ordinary American families dug into their backyards. It had worked for years. And it had worked purely because the Iron Curtain was opaque and because one man in Moscow understood that a belief and a weapon can perform the same function. The new administration nearly detonated the secret by accident. Robert McNamara had been Secretary of Defense for about 3 weeks, when in February 1961 he held a background briefing with reporters and said, in effect, that there was no missile gap, that there were no signs of a Soviet crash effort, and that whatever gap existed ran in America's favor. Reporters ran it. It landed in the papers within days, and it was a political catastrophe for a president who had campaigned on precisely the opposite claim. The administration walked it back. McNamara later called it a terrible mistake. It was not a mistake, it was the truth, said 8 months too early. By that autumn, the Kennedy administration had decided to stop hiding from the truth and start using it as a weapon. On October 21, 1961, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Roswell Gilpatrick, stood in front of the Business Council at Hot Springs, Virginia, and delivered a speech cleared by the State Department and by the President himself. Soviet bluster and threats of rocket attack, he said, aimed particularly at the European members of the NATO alliance, had to be evaluated against the hard facts of United States nuclear superiority. He described an American retaliatory force so large that any first move against it would amount to an act of self-destruction. That was the United States government in public telling Nikita Khrushchev that it had countered his missiles. What that did to Khrushchev is one of the genuinely contested questions of Cold War history, and it is worth being precise about who argues what. The historians Alexander Fosenko and Timothy Naftali, working with Soviet Presidium and intelligence archives, argue that Khrushchev's subsequent gamble in Cuba was driven substantially by weakness, and that the American unmasking of Soviet strategic inferiority, of which the Gilpatrick speech was the public capstone, pushed him toward a cheap way to rebalance the equation. Raymond Garthoff placed the exposure of the reverse missile gap first on his list of Khrushchev's motives. Others pushed back hard. Barton Bernstein emphasized the defense of Cuba itself. Sergei Khrushchev has insisted his father's overriding motive was protecting Castro from an American invasion, and has dismissed the strategic balance theories outright. Khrushchev's own memoirs put the defense of Cuba first, and equalizing the balance of power second. Gardoff himself conceded the obvious. We will probably never know the true weight of the motives. But the chronology is not in dispute. Within a year of being told in public that his missile force was a fiction, Nikita Khrushchev was loading medium-range ballistic missiles onto ships bound for Cuba, where shorter-ranged rockets he actually possessed in quantity could reach American cities without needing the intercontinental force he did not have. And here is a detail that almost everyone gets wrong. Corona did not find the missiles in Cuba. A Corona mission did photograph western Cuba around the beginning of October 1962, and the imagery was obscured by cloud and haze, and lacked the resolution to identify what was being built. The photographs that broke the Cuban Missile Crisis came from a U-2 flown over the island on October 14, 1962 by Major Richard Heiser. That film went to Arthur Lundahl's analysts in the same building, and on October 15, they identified the launch pattern of a Soviet medium-range ballistic missile site. Lundahl's team built the briefing boards. The President of the United States was shown them on the morning of October 16. The same room that had cheered at a coverage map 2 years earlier now told the President that there were nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. Nobody involved in any of it could say a word. Corona did not stay secret for 5 years or 10. It stayed secret for for 35. The Discoverer cover name was retired in 1962, and the launches simply became unlabeled Department of Defense missions. In 1963, the program went fully black. The engineers who designed the optics, the chemists at Rochester who solved the film problem, the winch operators and pilots of a squadron in Hawaii whose existence was classified. All of them went through their working lives, and in many cases through their entire lives, unable to explain to their own families what they had done. Some of them died before the government allowed them to say it out loud. Harold Mitchell received the Distinguished Flying Cross. His crew received air medals. The squadron won the Mackay Trophy for 1960. The citations could not describe what he had caught or why it mattered, or that it had rewritten the strategic assumptions of the United States. He went on to fly 117 missions in Vietnam and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1974. The aircraft he flew that morning, along with a capsule he caught, is on display today at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio, where visitors walk past it on their way to look at bombers. Richard Bissell, whose stubbornness through 13 consecutive humiliations put that film in the sky, was destroyed by something else entirely. In April 1961, he ran the Bay of Pigs operation, and it failed catastrophically, and it ended his career. He is remembered for the failure. He is almost never remembered for this. Merton Davies and Amram Katz, who wrote The Impossible Idea down at Rand in 1954, were not publicly honored for it until the year 2000, 46 years later. On February 22, 1995, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12951 and ordered the imagery declassified. In the end, more than 860,000 photographs taken between 1960 and 1972 were released to the public from a program that had flown 145 launches. The acting director of Central Intelligence at the time, Admiral William Steudman, offered the line that comes closest to being the thesis of this entire story. Corona, he said, was conceived in an era when facts were scarce and fears were rampant. And then there is the single best quotation about all of this, and it came from a man who knew he should not be saying it. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson, speaking to a private audience, began talking about the space program, and then said something he immediately knew he should not have. He prefaced it by saying he would not want to be quoted. The country, he said, had spent $35 or $40 billion on space. And he said that if nothing else had come out of it except the knowledge gained from space photography, it would be worth 10 times what the entire program had cost. Because tonight, he said, we know how many missiles the enemy has. And then the part that lands like a stone. It turned out, he said, that our guesses were way off. We were doing things we did not need to do. We were building things we did not need to build. We were harboring fears we did not need to harbor. A sitting president of the United States saying out loud that his country had spent a decade terrified of something that was not there. Plesetsk is still in operation. The forest complex in Arkhangelsk that Corona photographed, where 4 launch pads once constituted the entire strategic missile force of the Soviet Union, is today Russia's northern military cosmodrome. It is still where Russia tests its strategic rockets. The pads have changed, the address has not. And what happens there now is visible to anyone who cares to look. In September 2024, Russia attempted a test of the RS-28 Sarmat, the enormous silo-based liquid-fueled intercontinental missile that Russian state media had spent years promising would be unstoppable. The test failed, and it failed spectacularly. The world found out, not because Moscow announced it, and not because a spy reported it, but because commercial satellite companies photographed the site and sold the pictures. Imagery from Maxar and from Planet Labs showed a crater roughly 60 meters across where the silo had been. The analyst Pavel Podvig, looking at the images, summarized it in language nobody needed a security clearance to understand. It was a big hole in the ground. Independent analysts, working from satellite imagery, reported another apparent Sarmat failure in late November 2025. Moscow has confirmed none of it. It did not need to. The pictures were already public. No flying boxcar, no parachute, no salt plug, no 35-year secret. A commercial imaging company photographed a hole in the ground in northern Russia, and anyone with an internet connection could examine it over breakfast. That is the inversion, and it is close to total. Look at February 2022, when Maxar published photographs of a Russian military column stretched for dozens of kilometers along a road north of Kyiv, and the entire planet watched an invasion assemble itself in something close to real time. In 1960, a superpower spent 19 months and an enormous fortune to obtain a single roll of film. Today, a journalist can buy the equivalent. But be careful with the moral of that story, because the obvious version of it is too clean, and it is wrong. Concealment did not die. It relocated. Russia's modern deterrent does not sit on 4 fixed pads in a forest waiting to be photographed. It rides on road mobile launchers, the RS-24 Yars and its relatives, which drive off into enormous tracts of forest and disperse, and which Russia openly and regularly rehearses dispersing. It sits in hardened silos. It sits under the ocean in submarines. The entire architecture is designed around the assumption that everything above it is being watched at all times. And whether satellites can actually track those mobile launchers reliably is a live and genuinely unresolved argument among serious analysts right now. One school holds that modern remote sensing and signals intelligence are closing the gap. Another school, publishing in the Strategic Studies literature within the last 2 years, argues that a mobile launcher operating carefully can still defeat surveillance, largely because satellites are not everywhere at once and there are always gaps between passes. The Sarmat failure was visible because a silo is a hole in the ground, and a hole in the ground cannot move. The things that move are still very hard to count, so the particular question that Corona answered has closed. The general question underneath it has not. That question is the one Lyndon Johnson blurted out when he thought nobody was writing it down. How much of what a nation fears is actually there? In 1960, the United States was building a war machine against an arsenal of 4 missiles. It was not lying to itself on purpose. It simply could not see. And into the vacuum where the facts should have been, it poured its worst assumptions, and a shrewd man in Moscow who understood exactly what was happening cheerfully poured in a few more. What broke it was not a general, or a spy, or a statesman, or a treaty. It was 20 pounds of film in a falling can, and a cargo pilot on his 3rd pass 8,000 feet above the Pacific, catching something nobody had ever told him the name of.